The evening fog had settled over Fernbrook House like a shroud, muffling the distant sounds of the village and lending the grand old estate an air of solemn mystery. Inside, the housekeeper, Mrs. Pennington, moved briskly through the dimly lit corridors, her face pale as she muttered about something amiss in the study. It was there, she explained breathlessly, that Mr. Arthur Whitcomb had been discovered in a most perplexing predicament, his study door locked from the inside, his chair overturned, and a single, curious object left upon his desk, a small ivory chess piece, the king, standing upright with no other pieces in sight. No signs of forced entry marked the ornate door, and yet something had clearly gone wrong. Mr. Whitcomb, a man of meticulous habits, was known for his punctuality and unshakable routine, which made the entire scene all the more baffling. The servants whispered of a shadowy figure glimpsed in the garden earlier that afternoon, but no one could confirm more than a fleeting silhouette disappearing behind the hedges. By the time Miss Jane Marple arrived, summoned by the distressed household, the atmosphere had grown tense, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and fading candle smoke. She was immediately struck by the apparent impossibility of the situation. A locked room, a missing envelope of vital business papers, and a man supposedly unharmed yet clearly shaken by whatever had occurred. Her eyes, sharp and observant, flicked over the study with quiet scrutiny. The furniture was undisturbed except for the desk chair, and the windows were latched securely. The fireplace showed no recent activity beyond its lingering warmth, suggesting no hurried entry or clandestine exit by anyone of substantial size. Yet Miss Marple's instincts told her that the solution, though hidden in plain sight, would require careful attention to the smallest detail, less a teaspoon of logic, a pinch of human behavior. Mrs. Pennington handed her the ivory chess king, turning it nervously in her hands. It was just sitting there, Miss Marple, out in the centre of his desk. Mr. Whitcomb says he doesn't know why it's there. Miss Marple turned the piece thoughtfully, noting the subtle scratches along its base and a faint trace of graphite on one side, as if it had been used for something other than play. Her gaze wandered to the scattered papers, each document meticulously arranged except for one folded letter tucked under the blotter. It was addressed in an unfamiliar hand, and a faint trace of coffee rings suggested someone had been reading her, perhaps hastily hiding the correspondence. Curious, Miss Marple murmured, her mind weaving connections between the chess piece, the letter, and the locked room. The household soon revealed its web of half-truths and anxious omissions. The gardener, Mr. Collins, mentioned hearing a soft click near the study door, as if a lock had been tampered with. The maid, young and timid, confessed to noticing a man in a dark overcoat leaving through the servants' entrance while Mr. Whitcomb was in the garden, though she hesitated, unsure if he was a visitor or an intruder. Yet no footprints led from the garden to the study, and the locks themselves showed no signs of tampering, leaving Miss Marple to consider alternative explanations. She examined the hinges, the keyhole, and even the very grain of the wood, noting subtle imperfections only a trained eye, an extraordinarily curious one, could detect. It was in that silence, among the ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional sigh of the old house settling, that the puzzle began to reveal its first threads. The chess piece, she realized, was not a clue in the ordinary sense, but a marker, a message encoded in a language known only to those who understood Mr. Whitcomb's penchant for puzzles and secret correspondences. As she pieced together the timeline, Miss Marple noted that the missing papers, the folded letter, and the position of the chess king all pointed toward a visitor with intimate knowledge of both the house and its owner's habits. A key fact emerged. Mr. Whitcomb had been expecting a letter from an old friend, one whose signature matched the letter now hidden under the blotter. Whoever had left the chess king knew the message it carried would be noticed, a subtle signal meant to confuse anyone unfamiliar with the code. By studying the placement of the pieces, the traces of graphite, and the direction from which the faint coffee scent emanated, Miss Marple began to see a scenario where the room had never been forcibly entered at all. The visitor had used wit, timing, and inside knowledge to stage the scene, leaving behind a carefully constructed illusion of mystery. The unshakable order of the room, the lone chess piece, the overlooked coffee ring, each was a deliberate stroke in a tableau designed to baffle, yet every mark carried the signature of intent, speaking to Miss Marple with the quiet persistence of a whisper no one else could hear. By the time the household retired for the night, Miss Marple had already sketched the outlines of her solution, though she shared little, letting the tension settle and the mystery simmer. She understood that the outward chaos, the overturned chair, the locked door, The enigmatic chess king was merely a mask for the simplicity underneath. A visitor who relied on intimate familiarity with both the house and Mr. Whitcomb's habits, leaving a trail of misleading clues that only someone attuned to human quirks could unravel. In the quiet of the study, with shadows dancing on the walls and the fog still thick outside, the first pieces of the puzzle were in place, and the path to discovery was beginning to take shape. One subtle observation at a time, the crime, though seemingly unsolvable, had already whispered its secrets to the one person capable of hearing them. Miss Marple moved quietly through the study, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk as though greeting an old friend. She examined the chess king once more, turning it slowly between her thumb and forefinger. It was a simple object, but in the way it had been positioned, upright and alone, it seemed almost sentient, a silent witness to some hidden event. The graphite smudges were not random, they traced a faint, deliberate pattern, as if someone had sketched a fleeting outline on the surface before retreating in haste. She crouched to inspect the floorboards beneath the desk, noting a faint scuff that led to the side panel, a scuff easily overlooked by anyone untrained in observation but telling in its subtlety. It suggested movement, not of the body of a large intruder, but of small, precise hands maneuvering within the confines of the room. The local constable, Mr. Harris, bustled in, clipboards and notebook in hand, oblivious to these minor details. "Locked from the inside, Miss Marple," he said, tapping the door with authority. "No signs of forced entry, nothing disturbed quite the puzzle, isn't it? We're checking the grounds, questioning the staff. Standard procedure." He scribbled furiously, but Miss Marple barely glanced at him, her attention drawn instead to the faint ring of dried tea at the corner of the blotter and the slight indentations in the blotting paper itself. Someone had leaned over here, hurriedly written, perhaps copying something, and the pressure had left its ghost on the surface. That small imperfection, unnoticed by all but her, hinted at a visitor more careful than the average thief, someone who understood the household and Mr. Whitcomb's routines intimately. She spoke softly, almost to herself, tracing the faint marks with her fingertip. "Curious, isn't it?" she murmured. "The king alone, a folded letter tucked beneath, and these traces on the blotter. The room has been arranged to mislead, not merely disturbed by chance." Her eyes lifted to Mrs. Pennington, who hovered nervously at the doorway. "You saw no one enter, but did anyone leave anything else out of place? Small things, perhaps, that seemed trivial at the time?" Mrs. Pennington hesitated, then mentioned a silver letter opener she had found lying on a side table that morning, its usual place on the desk conspicuously empty. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A letter opener, a chess piece, a coffee-stained thing were fragments of a larger, deliberate puzzle. Moving toward the window, she noticed the slight tilt of the curtain rod, as though it had been adjusted recently, leaving an angle inconsistent with its usual alignment. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the garden paths in a muted grey, and yet the faint imprint of a footprint near the servants' entrance drew her gaze. Unlike the large boot prints expected from a random intruder, this was delicate, almost deliberate, its pattern suggesting someone had tested the ground before stepping carefully, mindful of leaving evidence behind. It was a small detail, easily dismissed, but Miss Marple saw it as a signature Agatha clue that someone had deliberately staged the scene to appear impossible. Even the reactions of the household provided insight. Mr. Whitcomb, though outwardly calm, had a slight tremor when speaking of the letter, his gaze flickering toward the chess piece, betraying unease at the memory it invoked. The maid, nervous and wide-eyed, had shifted uncomfortably when asked again about the visitor in the garden. These subtle reactions, invisible to those focused on procedure, spoke volumes. Someone had been there, someone known to the household, whose presence left marks only the observant could detect. Miss Marple straightened and looked around once more, the patterns forming a faint outline in her mind, though the full picture remained just out of reach. Each small imperfection, each displaced item, each odd reaction was a thread waiting to be pulled. While the authorities followed their routines, checking doors and recording statements, she saw the underlying logic hidden beneath the apparent chaos. The room, though locked and seemingly impossible, was speaking to her, and with patience, she would listen until the secrets of Fernbrook House yielded to understanding. The first hints of deception had emerged, subtle and understated, but unmistakable to a keen eye attuned to human nature and the quiet language of objects. Miss Marple settled herself in the drawing-room, where the household had gathered under the polite insistence of Mr. Whitcomb. She began her inquiries with the staff, speaking softly yet deliberately, encouraging them to recount even the smallest details. The maid, Clara, was first. Her eyes darted nervously, fingers wringing the hem of her apron, as she described the visitor she had glimpsed near the servants' entrance. "It was just a shadow, Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it might have been a passer-by at first, but he lingered, I think, just for a moment." She faltered, hesitated, then added hurriedly, "The second didn't see his face properly." Yet in the way she avoided the chess king on the table, Miss Marple noted a subtle unease, as if the object carried some significance beyond mere decoration. Next came the gardener, Mr. Collins, a sturdy man with a weathered face and precise manner of speech. "I heard a click, Mom, near the study door," he said confidently. "Might have been the latch, though I can't be certain. I didn't see anyone go in or out, not clearly. But there was movement in the garden, some rustling that seemed odd." His eyes flickered toward Mr. Whitcomb when he mentioned it, and Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of the man's jaw, the micro-expression of tension that betrayed worry more profound than he would admit. The gardener spoke with certainty, yet the fog outside, the shifting shadows of trees, and the timing he described left subtle inconsistencies that a casual observer might miss. Mr. Whitcomb himself, when questioned, seemed composed but careful, selecting his words with deliberate care. "I was in the garden, as always, enjoying a cup of tea," he said. "I returned to find the study door locked, the chair overturned, and that chess piece on my desk. I assure you, Miss Marple, I have no idea how it got there." I paused, almost imperceptibly, as if weighing whether to continue. "I might have misplaced my friend's letter earlier, but I cannot account for its current position." There was a slight tremor in his fingers as he gestured toward the desk, a contradiction to the otherwise steady tone of his speech. Miss Marple made a quiet note of it, understanding that even a man so accustomed to control could betray a hidden anxiety. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pennington, was eager to emphasize her thoroughness, yet her eagerness itself seemed telling. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I checked the doors myself this morning. Nothing was out of place, nothing amiss," she insisted, her voice tinged with defensiveness. Yet she stumbled slightly when asked if anyone had delivered letters that afternoon, claiming uncertainty about small parcels. Her insistence on order, combined with the vague memory, suggested that she might have noticed more than she admitted, perhaps a detail she preferred to keep to herself. Even the brief interactions with the staff revealed more than their words. Clara's quick glances at Mr. Whitcomb, the gardener's hesitant pauses, the housekeeper's forced precision, each betrayed subtle contradictions, the tiny fractures between what they said and what their behavior implied. Miss Marple listened, piecing together these fragments, aware that deception rarely arrived fully formed. It whispered first, in the pauses between sentences, the flicker of an eye, the overemphasis of minor details. Each person presented a story that seemed coherent on its surface but contained these delicate inconsistencies, like a finely woven tapestry with one thread slightly askew. As the afternoon wore on, the patterns began to emerge. Some witnesses were too eager to appear helpful, glossing over details that might complicate their accounts, while others seemed to hold back, as if weighing the risk of revealing the truth. The voices of the household created a chorus of partial truths, overlapping narratives, and subtle misdirections. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, letting the contradictions settle in her mind. The key, she sensed, was not merely in the facts recounted, but in the spaces between them and the hesitation, the evasions, the unspoken knowledge that each witness carried. The full picture of Fernbrook House's mysterious event remained elusive, yet the first strands of deception were unmistakable, waiting to be followed to their source. Miss Marple spent the early evening poring over the fragments of testimony and the subtle clues she had gathered, turning each detail over in her mind like a puzzle piece. The motives, she realized, were as tangled as the ivy climbing the walls of Fernbrook House. Mr. Whitcomb, though outwardly dignified, had recently altered his will, adding a clause that granted a significant inheritance to a distant relative, one of whom, Clara, the timid maid, had spoken in passing. Could greed have whispered in someone's ear, tempting them to test the limits of opportunity? Yet the absence of forced entry suggested an insider, someone with intimate knowledge of the house, and greed alone rarely demanded such intricate planning. Mrs. Pennington, always so eager to display her diligence, presented a different angle. Her devotion to order could mask a fear of exposure, a motive rooted in anxiety rather than malice. Perhaps she had intercepted a letter she ought not to have read, or perhaps she hoped to cover some minor indiscretion that would have caused scandal in the household. The way she emphasized her meticulous checking of doors and parcels hinted at a self-consciousness that, under the right pressure, might drive her to manipulate events-moving objects, arranging misleading clues, even creating a small tableau intended to misdirect. Miss Marple noted how easily fear could disguise itself as virtue, a lesson learned long ago in her quiet observations of human nature. The gardener, too, had a subtle stake in the events. Collins was loyal but not blind to the resentments of long service. He had glimpsed the world outside Fernbrook House, a world of wealth and privilege denied to him, and his faintly hesitant responses suggested a careful weighing of words. Was there envy in the mix, or a quiet resentment that could be leveraged into action? He had the knowledge to access every part of the estate, yet his restraint implied a moral boundary he had not crossed, though boundaries could be stretched when opportunity and motive intertwined. Miss Marple filed this quietly, knowing that sometimes those who appeared too upright were merely waiting for the right moment to act. And then there was the matter of the chess piece itself. Its presence seemed almost symbolic, a marker that could speak to hidden rivalries or old grievances. Perhaps it was a playful reference between Mr. Whitcomb and a friend, or perhaps it was a message left by someone seeking to unsettle him. The folded letter beneath the blotter, the faint coffee rings, and the subtle scuffs on the floorboards all suggested deliberate orchestration, not random chance. Every detail hinted at knowledge of routines and habits, of which only the household insiders, as someone closely connected, could be aware. Miss Marple began arranging the threads in her mind, juxtaposing alibis against potential motives. Clara's glimpse of a visitor, Collins' hesitations, Pennington's overeagerness, Whitcomb's careful concealment of unease formed a web of possibilities. Each person's story contained grains of truth, yet within those grains were spaces where deception could take root. The interplay of fear, envy, loyalty, and perhaps even subtle revenge created layers that had to be sifted carefully, lest a single misstep lead to the wrong conclusion. By the time twilight deepened and shadows stretched across the corridors, Miss Marple felt the first sense of clarity within the confusion. The web of motives was intricate, with no single strand explaining everything, but the patterns were emerging. Each person's actions, every hesitation, every detail of the stud-eyed chess king, the letter, the scuffs on the floor formed a lattice of intent. She could feel the rhythm of the household's secrets, the pulse of hidden desires that dictated behaviors often too small for anyone but the observant to notice. And as she sat quietly, considering connections, timelines, and opportunities, she knew that the next step required more than deduction. It required a careful observation of character, a sensitivity to the nuances of human impulse, and a patience that would allow the labyrinth of motives to unravel, one careful strand at a time. The following morning brought a flurry of activity to Fernbrook House, as the constable proudly announced what he believed to be a decisive breakthrough. A small envelope tucked behind the curtains in the drawing room had been discovered, containing a hastily scrawled note that implicated the gardener. The authorities were quick to seize upon it. The note's urgency, combined with Collins' hesitant statements from the previous day, seemed to provide the perfect resolution to a baffling puzzle. "Well, it appears we have our culprit," Mr. Harris declared, beaming, as he prepared to take Collins for questioning. The household sighed in relief, murmuring assurances that justice would be served. Collins, for his part, protested vehemently, insisting he had never written such a note, but the officers dismissed his denials as the protestations of a guilty conscience. Miss Marple, however, remained seated in the corner, her hands folded calmly in her lap, observing the excitement with quiet scrutiny. The note, though appearing damning, bore peculiarities that tugged at her intuition. The handwriting was uneven, as if forced, and the phrasing contained a series of awkward constructions that seemed deliberately misleading. It was the sort of detail an untrained eye might overlook, yet Miss Marple felt a prickling sense of unease. Something about the timing, the placement of the envelope, and the unnatural emphasis in the words suggested orchestration rather than confession. She glanced at Collins, whose eyes, though wide with anxiety, held a spark of confusion rather than guilt, a flicker of innocence amid the staged evidence. While the constables celebrated their supposed victory, Miss Marple quietly revisited the study, tracing the familiar lines of the desk and examining the chess king once more. Its solitary stance, the faint graphite smudges, and the tiny scuffs on the floorboards beneath it had not been explained by the authorities. If anything, the envelope only added another layer of artifice, a clever misdirection designed to draw attention away from the real perpetrator. She considered the placement of the letter, the peculiar coffee stains, and the subtle shifts in the household's atmosphere, noting how quickly the excitement over an apparent solution had overshadowed the underlying inconsistencies. Even Mr. Whitcomb, eager to close the unsettling chapter, seemed subtly uneasy. He praised the officers for their diligence, yet his hand trembled slightly when he mentioned the letter and glanced at the chess piece. Miss Marple noticed it, of course, as small signals of awareness that others ignored. She could feel the rhythm of the household adjusting, the invisible currents of tension that moved beneath polite conversation. The gardener's protests, the housekeeper's forced calm, Clara's timid avoidance of eye contact all, were pieces of a tableau that the authorities had yet to fully appreciate. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, observing the garden where the visitor had been seen. The fog hung low, thick and unbroken, masking paths and shadows. It struck her that the real criminal was likely watching, waiting, comfortable in the knowledge that the authorities were celebrating a false victory. Cleverly constructed misdirection was a weapon in skilled hands, and the envelope's discovery had played precisely into that strategy. Whoever had orchestrated the events understood the household, the habits of its residents, and the human tendency to seize resolution even when it was premature. As the officers prepared to escort Collins from the house, Miss Marple's mind raced through timelines, motives, and subtle clues that no one else seemed to notice. The chess king, the folded letter, the faint scuff marks, the coffee stain all were part of a message hidden in plain sight, deliberately left for the observant. She knew instinctively that the real criminal remained in the shadows, poised to act again when least expected. The early triumph of the authorities, gleeful though it seemed, was nothing more than an illusion, a brief moment of false certainty before the deeper truth would emerge. And in the quiet, watchful corners of Fernbrook House, Miss Marple prepared herself to follow that hidden trail, aware that patience, attention, and the subtleties of human behavior would reveal what a cursory glance could never uncover. As the day wore on, and the household settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple found herself wandering the corridors of Fernbrook House, her eyes tracing familiar features with a new, deliberate attention. The false victory of the authorities had left the air heavy with relief, but she sensed that beneath it lay currents unexamined. Her gaze fell once more on the study, lingering on the chess king. The object seemed almost to pulse with significance, a silent sentinel holding secrets that stretched far beyond the morning's commotion. In turning it over in her mind, Miss Marple recalled a peculiar incident from years earlier, a minor theft at the neighbouring estate, which had involved a similar tableau, a single chess piece left deliberately, carefully staged scene meant to baffle and mislead. The memory sparked a quiet recognition. The current events bore the unmistakable signature of someone familiar with both Mr. Whitcomb's habits and the subtleties of long-forgotten schemes. She began cross-referencing the household stories with what little she knew of the past. Collins had served in Fernbrook for over a decade, Mrs. Pennington longer still, and Clara's family had been connected to the estate in minor capacities for generations. The old theft, though officially closed and barely remembered by most, had involved a visitor known for meticulous planning and a fondness for misdirection. Though that person had vanished from public view decades ago, Miss Marple considered the possibility of lingering tight relationships that might explain the extraordinary knowledge of the house displayed in the current events. The chess piece, the coffee stains, the letter placement were hallmarks of someone who had once manipulated events with precision and patience, leaving traces subtle enough to escape ordinary attention. Turning her thoughts to Mr. Whitcomb, Miss Marple noted a fleeting tension in his expression whenever the previous theft was mentioned in passing. Though he had outwardly dismissed it as irrelevant, a tiny crease at the corner of his eyes betrayed recollection, a memory lodged uncomfortably in the mind. The gardener and housekeeper, too, shared quiet glances when the old case was briefly alluded to, as if some unspoken connection hummed beneath the surface of polite conversation. Miss Marple realized that the crime in the study was not isolated. It was entwined with past events, echoing a history of rivalries, small betrayals, and misjudged loyalties. The seemingly random selection of objects, the chess king, the envelope, the blotter, was deliberate, a coded message to someone who understood the lineage of secrets within the house. Clara, timid as ever, proved unexpectedly informative when questioned gently. She mentioned a conversation overheard years ago between Mrs. Pennington and a former servant, one that hinted at disagreements over family inheritances and minor grievances that had never escalated but had not been forgotten either. Miss Marple noted the subtle ways in which old grudges could fester quietly, influencing actions decades later. It was these small, lingering resentments, the invisible threads connecting the past to the present that explained the precision and cunning of the staged scene. Someone had studied the history of Fernbrook House, understood the weaknesses and fears of its residents, and used that knowledge to manipulate appearances. Returning to the study, Miss Marple sat in contemplation. The footprint patterns, the coffee stains, the graphite smudges all became meaningful in the context of this hidden history. The crime was no longer merely a question of who could have entered the room or who had motive in the present moment. It was the continuation of a story that had begun years ago, a quiet saga of unspoken rivalries and subtle manipulations. By understanding the past, Miss Marple sensed she could unravel the present deception. The real culprit, she now understood, had drawn upon memories, old loyalties, and lingering resentments, weaving them into a present-day tableau designed to confuse and mislead. And in the shadows of Fernbrook House, amidst forgotten corners and well-polished surfaces, she began to trace the faint outlines of the truth, aware that history, though silent, had left unmistakable footprints for those patient enough to follow. Miss Marple spent the late afternoon quietly observing the household, letting the ebb and flow of ordinary movements carry her attention to details others dismissed. She noticed Clara, dusting the mantel with careful precision, avoiding glances at the chess king. She saw Mrs. Pennington arranging the silverware in a precise, almost ritualistic order, and Collins tending the flower beds outside, though his hands lingered uncertainly over a path leading toward the servants' entrance. Miss Marple realized that direct questioning had already revealed the inconsistencies, yet the truth remained cloaked beneath layers of intent and performance. It was time for an unconventional approach, one that did not rely solely on words but on observation, human instinct, and the gentle pressure of suggestion. She called the household together once more, framing a small exercise as a casual game rather than an interrogation. "We have been discussing Mr. Whitcomb's correspondence," she said, her tone light, "and I thought it might be interesting to see how quickly one can recall certain objects in the study, just from memory." She gestured to the desk, the chess king, and the blotter, inviting each to speak in turn about where items were placed, how letters were folded, and the sequence of events they recalled. It seemed trivial, almost playful, yet Miss Marple understood that such a method often prompted subconscious reactions, revealing subtle truths that formal questioning could not. Each member of the household answered cautiously. Mr. Whitcomb described the arrangement with precision, as expected. Mrs. Pennington recited hers in careful detail, emphasizing procedures she had performed that morning. Clara's turn came and her gaze flickered toward the chess king, her fingers curling around the edge of her apron. She hesitated, then gave an account that was accurate but oddly vague in one small part: the precise placement of the silver letter opener. Her pause was almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple's trained eye caught the hesitation, the microsecond of uncertainty that hinted at something deeper. Then came Collins. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way he adjusted his stance, the way his eyes darted toward the sideboard where the envelope had been found. When asked about the sequence of letters on the blotter, his voice wavered. Then he laughed nervously, a gesture meant to diffuse attention but betraying internal tension. "The second thought I saw the letters moved differently," he admitted. The admission was small, almost dismissible, but it revealed a crack in the facade. The note found behind the curtain, the staged misdirection. The false victory of Gardner's subtle reaction implied that someone else, someone familiar with the household's rhythms, had orchestrated the scene with care. Miss Marple allowed the observation to settle, her mind weaving the threads together. The unconventional tactic, the gentle psychological nudge disguised as a memory exercise, had elicited a response that words alone could not have drawn forth. She realized that the true perpetrator had relied on the household's trust, assuming that confidence in routine and procedure would mask their actions. The hesitation, the nervous glance, and the fleeting laughter were not just personal quirks, they were indicators of awareness, the faint signature of manipulation that only the attentive could detect. As twilight deepened, Miss Marple reflected on the results. The ordinary objects, the chess king, the letter, the blotter, the silver letter opener, were more than props. They were instruments in a carefully staged puzzle designed to distract and mislead. The subtle crack in behavior exposed by her unconventional method illuminated the presence of someone carefully orchestrating appearances, someone who understood both human nature and the peculiar vulnerabilities of Fernbrook House. The game, it seemed, was far from over, and yet the first deliberate glimpse of the mind behind the deception had finally emerged, quietly, almost invisibly, through the art of observation rather than force. By the following morning, A sense of quiet determination had settled over Miss Marple. She reviewed her mental notes, retracing the subtle clues, the hesitations, and the small contradictions she had observed. The household moved about their routines, seemingly unaware that the balance of truth and deception was so fragile. She lingered in the study, examining the chess king one last time before turning her attention to the blotter and the folded letter beneath it. It had become clear that these small objects, seemingly innocuous, carried the weight of the entire mystery. They were the markers of intent, the silent witnesses to a carefully staged sequence of events. Yet before she could delve deeper, an abrupt disturbance shattered the calm. A shrill cry came from the drawing room, where the housekeeper, Mrs. Pennington, had been organizing correspondence. Miss Marple hurried to the room to find her standing beside an empty side table, eyes wide with alarm. The envelope that had sparked the constable's so-called breakthrough one supposedly implicating the gardener was gone. Not merely misplaced, but removed entirely. In its place lay a faint smudge of ink, a telltale trace of hurried hands attempting to erase evidence, and the silver letter opener, once so carefully arranged, now lying askew. Even the faint coffee stains on the blotter had been smudged, as if someone had attempted to obscure the original markings. Miss Marple's heart sank. Someone was actively working to bury the truth, and the sudden disappearance of the envelope transformed the investigation from a quiet exercise in observation into a race against deliberate sabotage. The constables arrived moments later, stunned and flustered. "It was right here a moment ago," Mr. Harris stammered. "How could anyone have taken it without our noticing?" Miss Marple's eyes, however, were fixed on the subtle traces left behind, faint fingerprints along the edges of the table, a slight indentation in the carpet leading toward the back corridor, and the odd angle of the door handle, suggesting it had been handled in haste. These were the hallmarks of someone who understood the household intimately, someone confident enough to manipulate appearances without fear of immediate detection. She called the household together once more, her voice calm but edged with the gravity of the moment. "The disappearance of this envelope is not mere mischief," she said. "Someone is attempting to control what we know, to obscure the path to the truth." She watched the reactions closely. Clara looked startled, her hands clutching her apron. Mrs. Pennington's face had paled, a twitch of nervousness betraying a faint unease. Even Mr. Whitcomb seemed momentarily unsettled, his composure fraying just enough to reveal genuine concern. Each reaction, Miss Marple knew, was a brushstroke in the portrait of intent, revealing where attention and anxiety intersected. The sudden vanishing of evidence introduced an urgent tension. Trust within the household had become precarious, and the line between ally and deceiver blurred. Miss Marple understood that the perpetrator was counting on this chaos, relying on the assumptions of the authorities and the household's instinctive desire for resolution to cover their tracks, yet she felt no alarm. Beyond cautious anticipation, such maneuvers were predictable to someone who had learned to read the subtle language of human behavior. Miss Marple returned to the study, her gaze settling once more on the chess king and the blotter, now smudged but still bearing faint traces of past events. The game had shifted, the stakes higher than ever, but the clues were not gone entirely. They had been rearranged, manipulated, made to seem less coherent, yet the logic beneath remained intact. The task was now to unravel this new layer of deception, to trace the hands that had sought to erase history, and to restore clarity before the truth could be lost entirely. In the silence of Fernbrook House, she understood that patience, observation, and a keen sense of human nature were now more critical than ever, for the real criminal moved confidently in the shadows, testing both resolve and perception, waiting for the moment to strike again. Night had fallen over Fernbrook House, cloaking its grand facade in shadows that seemed to thicken with every passing hour. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing room, examining the faint smudges on the blotter, when a sudden sharp noise echoed from the upper corridor, a crash followed by a stifled cry. She rose instantly, her senses alert, and hurried toward the source, her mind racing through the possibilities. The house, once merely the setting of a mysterious theft and a staged puzzle, had suddenly become a place of immediate danger. She reached the landing to find the door to Mr. Whitcomb's private study ajar, a room that had remained locked for much of the investigation, and inside, the scene that met her eyes froze her for a moment. Mr. Whitcomb's cousin, Reginald Hawthorne, had collapsed across the ornate carpet, a single knife wound in his side. Panic swept through the household as Mrs. Pennington screamed and Clara rushed forward to help, but Miss Marple stepped carefully, assessing the scene with the precision that had guided her through the preceding mysteries. There were no signs of forced entry, yet the knife had come from the collection on the wall removed quietly, with knowledge of both its location and the victim's routines. The timing, the choice of weapon, and the calculated placement suggested a perpetrator who had anticipated every movement, someone not only capable of orchestrating deception, but willing to escalate to violence when necessary. The constables arrived moments later, their expressions a mixture of shock and frustration. Another attack? But we thought Mr. Harris faltered, realizing the fragility of their previous solution. Miss Marple shook her head. This proves that the culprit was never caught, she said calmly, though her mind raced with the implications. Whoever had staged the envelope theft, who had smudged the blotter and stolen evidence, now demonstrated that they were still several steps ahead, capable of manipulating not only perception but action. Their confidence was dangerous, their knowledge of the household near absolute. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the study again, noting the subtle signs overlooked in the chaos. A faint smudge of ink on the edge of the desk, as if a note had been hastily moved or destroyed, a slight draft from the window that suggested someone had used it for an escape. And, most tellingly, the chess king lying on its side, no longer upright, a small yet deliberate reversal of the previous message. It was a signal, she realized, a taunt, or perhaps a clue indicating the perpetrator's awareness of her scrutiny and their willingness to challenge her indirectly. She turned to the household, observing reactions with a careful eye. Clara trembled, her hands shaking, while Mrs. Pennington seemed almost unnaturally composed, her lips pressed into a thin line as if restraining words she might regret. Even Collins, usually steady, had a tightness around the jaw, a subtle tension in the shoulders that betrayed anxiety. Each movement, each expression, was a fragment of the larger puzzle, yet now the stakes were higher, not merely the unraveling of a mystery, but the prevention of further harm. Miss Marple stepped back from the scene, breathing deeply, her mind threading together the recent events. The initial crime, the vanishing evidence, and now this violent act formed a continuous narrative, revealing the sophistication and audacity of the perpetrator. The game had shifted from observation to survival, from deduction to urgency. She understood with a clear and sober certainty that the real criminal was playing a long, deliberate game, testing the limits of patience, perception, and restraint. If she was to uncover the truth, she would need not only insight into human behavior but anticipation of its extremes, predicting actions before they occurred, and preparing to counter them before another tragedy could unfold. The house felt suddenly alive with tension, every corridor a potential stage for the next move, every shadow a silent witness to intent. Miss Marple's mind, methodical yet agile, began mapping possibilities, connections, and vulnerabilities. The perpetrator's audacity had shifted the investigation into a dangerous new dimension, one where timing and insight mattered as much as intellect. And as she gazed at the fallen chess king, she knew that the next steps would require courage as much as observation. For the game was no longer merely about solving a puzzle, it was about staying one step ahead of a mind willing to kill to conceal its secrets. As dawn broke over Fernbrook House, the soft light revealed a stillness that belied the turbulence of the previous night. Miss Marple moved quietly through the corridors, reviewing in her mind the events that had unfolded. The initial baffling crime, the disappearance of the envelope, and now the violent attack on Reginald Hawthorne. Each incident had seemed chaotic and unpredictable when taken alone, yet her instincts whispered that there was an underlying logic, a thread that connected these disturbances into a single coherent pattern. She retraced her steps through the study, noting the chess king now lying on its side, the faint smudges on the blotter, and the subtle shift of the desk chair. It was all deliberate, yet the meaning had been concealed beneath layers of misdirection. She paused, recalling an offhand remark made by Mrs. Pennington during the initial questioning, something so casual that it had seemed trivial at the time. "I always dust the chess set after tea," she had said, tilting her head toward the mantel. At the moment, Miss Marple had filed it away as an idle comment, but now it resonated differently. The chess king, the placement of letters, the faint graphite smudge were not arbitrary, they were messages in a code that relied on human habits and small routines. The perpetrator had exploited these tendencies, anticipating how the household would interact with their familiar objects, leaving clues in plain sight disguised as everyday actions. The casual remark, overlooked by everyone else, was a keen acknowledgement of the routine that had been manipulated. Turning her attention to Clara, Miss Marple noticed the way the maid's hands trembled when asked about the silver letter opener, and how Colin's gaze lingered on the corner of the room where the envelope had vanished. These small gestures, seemingly insignificant on their own, now formed a recognizable rhythm. Each reaction, hesitation, and movement mirrored the sequence of objects and events in the study. A chess piece moved, a letter folded, a note planted and removed. The pattern emerged not in the grand gestures, but in these minor deviations from expectation, the subtle manipulations that only someone intimately familiar with both the house and its residents could execute. Miss Marple's gaze fell once more on the fallen chess king. The previous placement had been upright, a deliberate marker. Now its toppled position indicated an intentional shift, a signal from the perpetrator that they were aware of the scrutiny they faced. Combined with the smudged blotter and the careful removal of the envelope, it suggested that the criminal was not only following a meticulous plan, but also reacting to the household's responses, anticipating how each person would behave and leaving cues that would only be recognized by someone attentive enough. She began mentally reconstructing the timeline. The initial incident, the planted evidence, the removal of the envelope, the attack on Reginald Hawthorneal movements orchestrated with foresight. The chaos had been a veil, but the rhythm of human behavior, the predictability of small habits had revealed the underlying order. The perpetrator had relied on the assumption that the authorities and household would focus on dramatic elements while ignoring the subtle, everyday actions that provided the real key to understanding the plot. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had mapped the sequence of events with clarity. The pattern hidden in plain sight united the present disturbances with the echoes of the past, the vanishing envelope, the chess piece, and the carefully observed reactions of the household. Each minor detail, each hesitation, each habitual gesture had been a signpost, overlooked by everyone except the one willing to watch closely and think in layers. The truth was no longer a distant, abstract concept, it was tangible, structured and waiting to be uncovered. And in the quiet of Fernbrook House, amid the polished surfaces and muted sunlight, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of recognition, sense that the final moves of this intricate, deliberate game were now within reach. Miss Marple spent the late morning observing the household, letting the ordinary rhythms of Fernbrook House speak to her in ways the constables could not perceive. She watched Mrs. Pennington arrange the silverware again, this time with an almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders, and she noted how Collins moved through the garden, eyes constantly flicking toward the upper windows, as if expecting someone or fearing someone's gaze. But it was Clara who finally drew her attention in a way that illuminated everything. The young maid, timid and withdrawn, had been quietly fidgeting with a loose button on her apron, her eyes betraying a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration for the orchestrator of the recent chaos. Miss Marple realized that the key to understanding the motive lay not in the obvious threads of greed, inheritance or jealousy, but in the subtle interplay of fear, pride, and a deeply rooted need for control. She gathered the household once more in the drawing room, explaining that she intended to review the events in sequence. As she recounted the initial discovery of the chess king, the vanishing envelope, and the attack on Reginald Hawthorne, she watched carefully for reactions. Mrs. Pennington's jaw tightened when Miss Marple mentioned the envelope, and Colin's hands twitched briefly, almost imperceptibly, as she spoke of the study's scuffed floorboards. But it was when Miss Marple referred to the subtle shift in the chess king's position that a tiny, almost invisible gasp escaped Mrs. Pennington. It was the only break in her otherwise impeccable composure, and it spoke volumes. "The pattern has been consistent," Miss Marple began, her voice calm but unwavering. Every action, every detail, every shift in the room was designed not simply to hide a theft or intimidate a relative, but to assert dominance over the household itself. The individual responsible has been testing the limits of fear and trust, shaping responses, measuring reactions, and finding satisfaction not merely in material gain but in the subtle power of control. Her gaze settled on Mrs. Pennington, whose lips pressed tightly together, betraying a rare crack in her composed facade. "It is not greed that drives this, not simple resentment. It is the compulsion to manipulate, to orchestrate the movements of others as though they were pieces on a board, and to enjoy the knowledge that the truth exists but remains just out of reach for all except the observant." The room was silent, the weight of Miss Marple's words settling over them. Even the constables, who had grown accustomed to viewing crime in terms of clear motives and evidence, felt the chill of something more intricate and insidious. Miss Marple's eyes never left Mrs. Pennington. You see, the chess king was never just a piece. It was a signal, a challenge, a test. Each subtle alteration smudges on the blotter, the placement of letters. The staged attack was a way to see how the household would react, how carefully they observed, and whether anyone could anticipate the next move. This is why you went to such lengths, manipulating not only objects but perception itself. Mrs. Pennington's hands trembled, and she let out a quiet, reluctant sigh, as though some internal barrier had finally broken. The second wanted to see if I could orchestrate it perfectly, she admitted, her voice low, almost reverent, to know that even those closest could be led to confusion, that I could test my skill against their attention. I never thought it would go this far. Her eyes were wide, revealing not just fear of exposure, but a deep, unsettling pride in her own cleverness, a compulsion that had driven her to extremes. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, understanding now why the crime had escalated from an initially baffling puzzle to a near tragedy. It was not the inheritance, not the jealousy, not even revenge. It was the need to manipulate, to assert psychological dominance, and to see the chaos of others' reactions as a reflection of her own control. The true motive, hidden beneath layers of apparent reason and mundane explanations, was the satisfaction of intellect and strategy, a dangerous fascination with influence over human behavior. And in that quiet realization, the threads of the entire mystery fell into place, revealing the chilling psychology of a mind willing to push boundaries far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Miss Marple spent the afternoon arranging the household with deliberate calm, her mind tracing every step that had led to this moment. The chess king, now returned upright on the desk, was positioned exactly where she wanted it, a silent signal that the game was nearing its climax. She had rehearsed the sequence carefully, the placement of the envelope, the subtle suggestion of an impending inspection, the orchestrated presence of all members of the household in the drawing room. Every detail was designed to provoke the smallest crack in Mrs. Pennington's composure, to allow the truth to emerge without overt force, and to reveal the final piece of the intricate puzzle. When the household gathered, Miss Marple spoke softly, almost conversationally, recounting the events with precision. We have observed the chess piece, the smudged blotter, the vanished envelope, and even the subtle reactions of those present, she said, her eyes sweeping the room. Each of these, though seemingly trivial, has told a story. It is now time to see if that story is complete. She paused, letting her words sink in, watching the expressions around her. Clara fidgeted nervously, Colin shifted on his feet, but it was Mrs. Pennington who held her breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The calmness of Miss Marple's tone contrasted sharply with the tension building in the room, creating a pressure that was palpable. You see, the game has been ongoing for some time, though few have realized its true nature. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. The manipulation, the misdirection, and even the act of violence itself have been calculated to test the household's attention, patience, and insight. And yet, one small detail, repeated yet unnoticed, has shown us who truly orchestrated these events. She gestured to the blotter, the chess king, and finally the envelope, allowing Mrs. Pennington to follow the gaze of all eyes in the room. Her pulse quickened, and the mask of composure she had maintained began to falter. "I believe it was you, Mrs. Pennington," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but absolute. Every movement, every hesitation, every carefully arranged object aligns with the pattern only someone intimately familiar with the household could execute. The test of attention, the subtle challenge to perception, it was all yours. You sought not just to mislead, but to see if anyone could anticipate your intentions. The room seemed to contract, the air thickening as all eyes turned to Mrs. Pennington, whose lips trembled, and whose eyes darted toward the door, as if weighing a last desperate escape. For a moment she said nothing, and then the truth poured out in a flood of quiet confession. "Yes, it was me," she admitted, voice trembling. "I wanted to know that even those closest could be misled, that I could control the outcome without being caught. I never thought it would escalate, but I could not stop myself." The composure she had maintained throughout the investigation shattered completely, leaving only fear and a strange, obsessive pride in her cleverness. Miss Marple remained calm, her presence unflinching. She had anticipated this moment, the confession, and the tension that would precede it. The danger had passed not through confrontation but through the careful construction of conditions that allowed truth to surface naturally. Collins exhaled in relief, Clara's hands unclenched, and Mr. Whitcomb's shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. The threat, which had hovered so close for so long, had been neutralized, not through force or accusation, but through understanding, observation, and patience. As the constables moved to take Mrs. Pennington into custody, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The chess king remained upright, the blotter still bearing its faint traces, and the envelope, carefully restored to its place, symbolized the resolution of a game that had been as psychological as it had been tangible. The threads of deception, manipulation, and human frailty had all been unraveled, and the final confrontation had proven that even the most meticulous of schemes could be undone by patience, insight, and an eye that noticed what everyone else overlooked. Fernbrook House exhaled, and in its quiet, Miss Marple felt the familiar certainty that the truth, long hidden beneath layers of careful artifice, had finally been revealed. The calm that had settled over Fernbrook House seemed almost tangible, a fragile exhale after days of tension, yet Miss Marple's instincts refused to relax. She watched the constables escort Mrs. Pennington to the carriage, noting the faint tremor in her hands and the rigid posture she maintained even in apparent defeat. Yet as the carriage disappeared down the lane, a small, nearly imperceptible detail caught Miss Marple's attention: a glint of silver on the floor near the hearth, partially hidden beneath the rug. Kneeling, she picked up a tiny fragment of paper, folded with care, marked with neat handwriting that was not Mrs. Pennington's. Her brow furrowed as she examined it. It was a note, brief and cryptic, hinting at instructions given, timing coordinated, and, most importantly, the final movement in a plan that had only partially unfolded. Her mind raced through the sequence of events: the chess king, the smudged blotter, the vanished envelope, the attack on Reginald Hawthorne, and the confession of Mrs. Pennington. All of these had been pieces of a complex game, yet the handwriting on this note revealed a subtle but undeniable thread she had overlooked. The confession, the staged chaos, and the psychological tests had all been orchestrated to shield someone else, a hidden hand that had manipulated Mrs. Pennington, and perhaps others, without their awareness. The mastermind, she realized with a thrill of apprehension, was someone entirely unexpected, someone whose proximity had allowed them to oversee every development while remaining in the background. She retraced the day's events in her mind, noting the smallest of anomalies: Colin's quick, almost imperceptible glances toward the back corridor during questioning, Clara's hesitations when recounting minor details of letters and furniture, the faint coffee stains that had not matched any previously observed cup. Each of these, trivial in isolation, now appeared to be subtle signals, left for someone attuned enough to notice her perhaps as unintended slips by someone who had assumed complete invisibility. The note confirmed what she had suspected. The real orchestrator was not Mrs. Pennington, but someone who had manipulated her into playing the role of the villain, using her pride, compulsion, and psychological drive as a shield to keep attention away from themselves. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, settling on Mr. Whitcomb. The elderly gentleman appeared genuinely relieved, yet the micro-expressions, the slight tightening of his jaw when the note was mentioned, the carefully measured calm in his posture, suggested a quiet calculation. Could it be that he had, knowingly or unknowingly, guided events to ensure his own secrets remained protected? Miss Marple considered this possibility carefully. His motives were subtle but plausible: the preservation of family legacy, avoidance of scandal, and the desire to control perception without overt force. The layers of deception had been brilliantly stacked, and the final revelation now demanded that she reconsider everything she had thought resolved. She moved swiftly but quietly, gathering Collins and Clara in the drawing room, speaking in measured tones. The confession we accepted, while truthful in one sense, was not the whole story, she explained. There is another mind behind these events, someone who guided actions from the shadows and relied upon the manipulation of others to achieve their ends. The constables listened, perplexed, as Miss Marple outlined the subtle signals and the cryptic note, demonstrating how attention to minutiae revealed the hidden architect of chaos. As the afternoon sunlight slanted across the polished floor, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. The game was not yet over, but the final pieces were within reach. The real mastermind had assumed invisibility, believing themselves untouchable, yet the careful tracing of habits, the study of reactions, and the tiniest of overlooked signals had exposed a vulnerability. The last-minute twist would test her ingenuity, patience, and insight, but she knew that, with precision and composure, she could unravel even this final layer of deception and bring clarity to the labyrinthine puzzle that had gripped Fernbrook House for so long. The stage was set for one final confrontation, and Miss Marple was ready. Miss Marple spent the late afternoon tracing the final threads of the case, assembling the household in the drawing room once more, her presence calm yet commanding. The cryptic note she had discovered, coupled with the subtle anomalies she had observed in gestures, glances, and micro-expressions, had led her to a startling conclusion. The real architect of the chaos had been hidden in plain sight. Using Mrs. Pennington's compulsive need for control as a shield, she began to speak, her voice deliberate and even, allowing each word to settle into the minds of those present. The initial crimes, the planted evidence, and the staged attack were orchestrated by someone who understood the habits of this household, who could anticipate reactions, and who knew precisely how to manipulate perception. Mrs. Pennington's role was pivotal, but she was guided, knowingly or not, by another hand more subtle, one more calculating. Eyes turned toward Mr. Whitcomb, who now sat upright, eyebrows raised slightly in unease. Miss Marple continued, carefully recounting the overlooked clues: the faint smudge of ink on the blotter, the misaligned chess king, the carefully timed disappearance of the envelope, and the fragment of the note that had escaped notice until now. Each small irregularity, she said, was not random. They were deliberate signals, intended to mislead, to test, and to conceal the actions of the one truly behind these events. The mastermind's greatest weapon was patience and the assumption that no one would notice subtleties in routine behavior. She paused, letting the weight of her words resonate. The constables leaned forward, struggling to grasp the complexity of the revelation. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she realized the depth of deception that had surrounded her. Collins, who had maintained an outward calm, now exhaled shakily, his eyes flicking nervously toward Mr. Whitcomb. The room, previously filled with the illusion of closure, was now charged with the unsettling awareness that the true villain had been watching, anticipating, and guiding outcomes with a chilling precision. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the chess king, upright and solitary on the desk. It was the ordinary habits, the sequence of letters, the placement of objects, the timing of gestures that concealed the extraordinary cunning of the culprit. Each move was deliberate, intended to misdirect, while the real plan remained hidden in plain sight. She allowed a faint smile, tempered by gravity, to cross her features, and yet, as subtle as their hand was, it left behind the faintest traces, which, when carefully observed, reveal the true story. Then came the moment of truth. Mr. Whitcomb, who had remained quiet, shifted uncomfortably. The micro-expressions Miss Marple had noted, the slight tightening of his jaw, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact, the almost imperceptible tension in his posturno became undeniable. Faced with the detective's composure and the weight of accumulated evidence, his facade cracked. I did not intend for it to escalate, he confessed, voice low and controlled but quivering with the effort of restraint. I nudged events, but I never expected the consequences to reach this level. Miss Marple nodded solemnly, her expression neither triumphant nor scolding. The web of manipulation had been unraveled, the hidden motives exposed, and the dangerous mind behind Fernbrook House's turmoil laid bare. Justice, at least in the moral sense, had been served. The orchestrator's actions were now known, the deception revealed, and the household freed from the grip of subtle intimidation and fear. Yet there remained an unease, a lingering sense that a mind capable of such careful orchestration could, in some other form or place, continue to elude the world's notice. As the constables prepared to take Mr. Whitcomb and Mrs. Pennington into custody, Miss Marple quietly reviewed the hidden signals one last time. She explained the clues overlooked by others: chess king, the blotter smudges, the fragment of note, the reactions of hands and eyes demonstrating once more why careful observation, patience, and understanding of human nature had placed her always one step ahead. Fernbrook House exhaled, a fragile calm settling over its corridors, yet Miss Marple, aware of the subtle currents of human ambition and compulsion, knew that vigilance was the price of truth, and that in some unseen corner, the mind that had orchestrated so much chaos still lingered, quietly calculating, waiting for another opportunity. Fernbrook House had settled into a calm that seemed almost unnatural, the grand corridors echoing only with the soft shuffle of servants attending to their routine tasks. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room for a moment, letting her eyes sweep over the polished surfaces, the upright chess king, and the faintly smudged blotter. Everything now bore the weight of resolved chaos, yet her trained mind remained alert. Patterns, motives, and confessions had all been laid bare, and justice, in the sense that those responsible were known, had been achieved. And yet, as she prepared to leave, A subtle unease lingered, a whisper that perhaps not every secret had been unearthed. It was a small detail that first caught her attention, the fragment of handwriting on the note she had found earlier. Though it had revealed the hidden hand guiding Mrs. Pennington, part of the message remained unfinished, the last line trailing off in a careful curl of letters that suggested a thought interrupted or an intention deferred. Miss Marple studied it closely, tracing the faint strokes with a delicate finger. There was something deliberate in the incompleteness, a subtle hint that the story she had untangled might not be the entire tale. Perhaps a message had been left for someone else, an instruction or warning that the world outside Fernbrook House had yet to receive. Clara, standing near the mantel with a faint expression of relief, noticed Miss Marple's contemplation. "Is something wrong, Miss Marple?" she asked softly. Miss Marple shook her head, her smile gentle but enigmatic. "Not wrong, my dear, merely unfinished. Even when the immediate danger is past, human intentions often leave traces that linger, hints that something more may be at play. One can resolve one layer of a mystery only to find another concealed beneath it." Her eyes swept across the room once more, catching a shadow near the upper staircase where no one should have been. It was probably nothing, she reassured herself, yet her intuition nudged her to remain vigilant. She moved toward the doorway, gathering her coat and bag, while the constables busied themselves with the paperwork of the arrests. "You see," she said quietly to Mr. Harris as they passed, "a crime is rarely a single event. It is a story, layered with motives, coincidences, and human behavior. One resolves what can be resolved, but the echoes often remain, in minor inconsistencies, in subtle signals, and in the actions of those who remain silent." The constable nodded, though he did not fully grasp the quiet thrill of anticipation that stirred within her. On the path leading from Fernbrook House, the winter sun slanted low across the hedges, casting long shadows that stretched toward the horizon. Miss Marple walked slowly, savouring the crisp air, allowing her mind to review every gesture, every smudge, every hesitation she had observed over the past days. Even as the house receded behind her, she could not shake the sense that a single overlooked element, a stray footprint in the garden, a glance exchanged between two minor household members, the unfinished line on that note was a signal, a thread that might, at some distant moment, lead to another revelation. She smiled faintly to herself, a mixture of satisfaction and curiosity. Fernbrook House had yielded its secrets, yet human nature, she knew, always left room for mischief, deception, and the quiet continuation of stories long thought closed. The case that had seemed so neatly concluded carried within it the seeds of future intrigue, and Miss Marple's keen mind had already begun tracing them, aware that one step ahead was the only way to navigate a world where the ordinary concealed the extraordinary. As she disappeared down the lane, the snow glinting softly beneath her boots, the house stood in silent watch, a reminder that mysteries, once born, never truly end, merely wait for the next observant mind to uncover their hidden layers.